This episode of the Craftsman Online podcast is sponsored by Bricks Masons. From elegant Masonic rings that showcase your commitment to our craft to finely crafted regalia and apparel that honor your tradition, Bricks Masons delivers quality and craftsmanship that truly stands out. Shop now at bricksmasons.com and use promo code CRAFTSMAN, that's CRAFTSMEN, to receive free shipping with your first order.
The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or craftsmanonline.com. Welcome to the Craftsman Online podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. And now your host, Worshipful Brother, Michael Arce.
Hey, welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast. You've joined us for an episode on From the Gavel to the Gigabyte as we bring back one of our frequent guests. He's also a regular contributor to craftsmanonline.com on our blog, and you've also seen him as a panelist at the Craftsman Online Reading Room, Brother Jason Short, who, when he's not part of our working group, he's also a speaker at the Livingston Library, and that's why I've got him on this episode as we talk about his most recent presentation. I just think the name of it's cool. Let's start there, Jason. From the Gavel to the Gigabyte, where did you come up with this?
It has a good ring to it, right? I actually used ChatGPT. I was in the car with my girlfriend, was in a vintage store, and I'm out there trying to figure out what this topic was going to be. And so I was like, okay, ChatGPT, give me 20 topics to talk about.
Your presentation is all about using technology, like say, hey, give me the idea of if you think 300 years ago, brothers didn't have that resource, and here you are able to do it now.
It was kind of a self-fulfilling thing. It all kind of came together when I saw that. I realized what I was doing it on. I couldn't help but to want to lean into a historical lecture on how we got here and what benefit there is from it, you know.
I think a lot of brothers listening are going to be aware of the history of Freemasonry just in general, and it is a very vast history over 300 years. But the part that was really interesting is you started out with how our fraternity evolved from operative Masons to speculative Freemasons in a lodge setting. And you used a term that I was like, ooh, I got to look into this one. So tell us about the exception and how these early stonemason meetings really kind of served as a foundation for Masonic lodges.
Sure. The exception was started as a sort of pendant body to the operative Masonic companies of the Middle Ages. And we find that after the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s, many operative lodges were really hurting for membership and strapped for cash. So what I believe was in an effort to help infuse more revenue and security for their members, they started to admit non-operative Masons. What was started really as an exclusive club for the elite within the building trade, that extended into a philosophical society for gentlemen, army officers, and noblemen, and these members were considered the exception because they gained admittance into the craft not by the means of the 7 years of operative apprenticeship, but through a generous admittance fee that they paid to secure the membership.
Okay. So it's safe to say that every brother that you and I know is an exception.
Exactly. We are free and accepted Masons.
Right. Exceptions. Yeah. For what you stated, but then I also started thinking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, we do have, at least in the first degree, you have to pay the initiation fee before you can even become a member and go through the degrees, which that traces back to the exception as well.
Before that, you would be an apprentice and you weren't making any money, so they couldn't expect you to pay anything. You were being paid with like food and board, essentially. Like the wages of a fellow craft. But Yeah, these guys, it seems that it seems that someone out there had this great idea of, hey, we need money. Why don't we just let people with money into our craft?
Problem solved.
Yeah, I mean, what's cool though is the direction it took.
Tell us about that. What was the direction? Where did it go?
There was an influx of this philosophical kind of Enlightenment era thinking. There was uh, a lot of these gentlemen coming in liked the liberal arts and sciences aspect, as well as saw a lot of parallels with the royal art, which was like alchemical, hermetic thought. And it seems to me that what was initially very geometry centered, and the operative lodges used to call it the art a science, whereas these new guys who are coming in who paid the fee, I mean, they're having these basically like these table lodges, these festive boards, they're getting together and talking about philosophy and the royal art. So that direction itself, I think, is really profound.
I don't want to say that Freemasonry meant more to men during that time, because I think that that would disregard a lot of passion that we know with brothers that are into Freemasonry. But it did kind of seem something larger in society if you were a Freemason then than now, where if I talk to colleagues at work or just casual friends and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm a Freemason, it just literally just soars right over their head. Not even as it is an engaging as a conversation we'd have about weather or the price of gas or whatever these days. But back then, to be a Freemason really was a distinguished title when you talk about the royal art and the love and the passion that was there.
Absolutely. I mean, even in the going back prior to the speculative masonry, we know when we get into the Middle Ages, some of the old charges said that to be even admitted as an apprentice, you need to come from some sort of nobility or from some fame. So the being associated with this craft was already somewhat of like a hoity-toity level of nobility. Um, I like to think too that it's not that there wasn't a lot going on, because there was definitely a lot going on, but the social media of that time, especially in the early 1700s, was like newspapers. Like that was the internet for these guys, and so as some of these articles started to come out, not only detailing what this free and accepted Masonic fraternity was doing, but that nobility, like the Duke of Montague, was seated as their Grand Master. That was really compelling, I think, to the general person at the time.
And I like the way you explain that, because when I talk about the difference or the transition from operative to speculative Freemasonry, I say, well, think of the philosophers or the free thinkers of that time. They came into these, I don't want to say that the stone guilds were dying. They were just kind of drying up as architecture and building design it changed or was innovated from one era to another area, and or era from one era to another era. So they did move areas too, if you think about it. But these philosophers came in, that were heavily influenced with the Age of Enlightenment and all of the thinkers of that time, and they said, hey, we're going to take this operative guild as a structure, and we're going to replace these tools that have meaning with them with meanings of things that have a deeper or higher level thinking, and just kind of inject that, and we're just going to slide in and take this place. And then usually I get the same reaction from people. They're like, oh, and I'm like, and that's why they're called Freemasons today. It has nothing to
Yeah.
do with the fact about bricks and mortar, because none of them do that anymore.
Well, what's interesting is like the early 1600s, like right as the operative craft started to really need membership, we saw like Robert Flood's alchemical, what is it, like a chemical wedding,
Mm.
right? And And then, like some 40 years later, 43 years later, Elias Ashmole is initiated as what was considered to be the first speculative Mason, but what I found was definitely not the first speculative Mason. But these guys were like
Mm.
alchemists, like, really, really heavily invested in that, and renowned for uh, for their work. So yeah, it's really interesting because where the operatives were working with material construction, these guys were building temples in their mind's eye.
There was also kind of this surge in popularity as well. And this was a really interesting time because I'm getting into the Grand Lodge period of 1717. And I call it that because that's when a group of lodges got together and said, hey, we're going to declare ourselves, first of all, open, because up until that point, Freemason was definitely a quote unquote secret society or secret club. And we're going to say, hey, we're a group of lodges. We're getting together. We're going to form a Grand Lodge in England, and that's basically, as we look at it, as where the modern, I know it's crazy to think something that far back is considered where modern Freemasonry was kind of born, but that's kind of the time and the place. And what was interesting is that when it came to organizing these grand lodges, now we had to have written rules. And you detail the effect of the old constitutions. You had mentioned that. The Ancient and the Honorable Society of Freemasons, and Robert's constitutions, and then Anderson's constitutions, which was actually the first Masonic publications. What was the impact of these documents on shaping those early years of Freemasonry?
Anderson's Constitution is like describing American football, and Robert's Constitutions is like describing rugby. They're they're really similar, but they're entirely different sports. And what happens in 1717 with the Premier Grand
Hmm.
Lodge is this group of the exception, these speculative gentlemen masons, are getting together and saying, you know what, we need a text that organizes what we're on about. As opposed to Robert's constitutions, which is an amalgamation of manuscripts and ancient charges and regulations that have a lot to do with practicing operative Masonic craft and trade. It has to do with the wages that are spent and or paid to members, how to organize themselves, a very like technical manual, whereas like the legend of Freemasonry is really expounded upon within Anderson's constitutions and speculative masonry.
To think how many copies of that would have been available and how people would have learned about that, and then it being taken into, as I like to call it, the practice of Freemasonry. One aspect that they really focused on is exposés. You had talked about the printing press was basically the social media of that time with the pamphlets and everything. That is how you would, it's crazy to think about it now, but people would literally walk up to you on the streets back then and hand you something. And that's how you learned whatever was going on in the world or what was important to them. And these were extremely popular. Masonic exposés were probably the one insight into the craft for non members, because this is where people tried to tell you what they thought the secrets of Freemasonry was. And I'm sure you looked through a lot of these during your research for your presentation. Was there a particular publication or writing that you found to be maybe entertaining or interesting?
Most interesting, I think, is there's there was a paper I found published from 1946 in the Lodge of Research of Leicester, called "An Examination of the Early Masonic Catechisms" by H. Carr, and this article compares 16 different Masonic catechisms and exposés that were published or recorded from 1696 until 1730, with Samuel Pritchard's Masonry Dissected. Um, Super interesting and very informative. It examines all of the questions and answers that are published through this time, and sort of tries to root out the stuff that's just bogus or that we don't really see any other relationship to within the craft, and distill out the stuff that is like, this is masonry, or this we can really say was actually practiced. So very, very interesting article. Now, most entertaining though, uh, the Post Boy issue 5373, which is the yeah, it's the second Masonic expose published in a newspaper.
Never heard of this one.
Yeah, it's totally overlooked, but it was issued December 26th through 28th of 1723, which is the same year Anderson's constitutions are published, as well as the first Masonic expose some months prior. However, this issue of the Post Boy is incredibly rare. And I think the only known copy exists. It's preserved with the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree in the Southern jurisdiction in Washington, D.C. So if you, Brother RC, have an opportunity to run down to the temple there, you should check it out. There's this gentleman's letter to his son from 1726. It reads, I remember when I was last in town, there was a specimen of examinations published in the Post Boy, but so industrious were the Masons to suppress it that in a week's time, not one of the papers was to be found. Wherever they saw them, they made away with them. I just really picture back then when this expose came out, which is around the feast of St. John the Evangelical, how wild these things must have just flown off the press. Whether Masons were seeking them out and burning them, or if they were looking for them because they wanted them from their own memory, or what was going on, I found it just incredibly entertaining to reflect on.
The Craftsman Online podcast is now sponsored by BricksMasons.com, our favorite destination for all of our Masonic shopping needs. Whether it's apparel for yourself or a cool gift idea for another brother, make BricksMasons.com your online marketplace where tradition meets innovation. Stay warm this winter in a cool Master Mason Blue Lodge hoodie. You can choose from 7 different solid colors that feature sports-style design lettering with Masons and the number 3 along with a square and compasses on the front. Sizes run from small to 3XL, so they literally fit everybody. Order now and get your hoodie in 14 days or less for just $30 at BricksMasons.com. Visit BricksMasons.com and explore their extensive catalog. Elevate your Masonic experience with style and substance. Plus, Craftsman Online podcast listeners use promo code CRAFTSMAN, that's CRAFTSMEN, at checkout to enjoy free shipping with your first order. Brothers, do you remember how you felt when you were first called to Freemasonry? The excitement of each degree? If you can still feel that call of the East, you're encouraged to apply to join the Scottish Rite Northern Masonic jurisdiction. The Scottish Rite offers Master Masons like you an opportunity to continue your Masonic journey and delve deeper into our craft through their 29 degrees. And there's an easy way to join the Scottish Rite. It's called Join the Rite Night, a virtual initiation where you can witness the requisite 4th degree and officially become a Scottish Rite Mason. There's 7 opportunities to join online from February 1st to April 25th. Here's what you do. Visit the Scottish Rite online at srnmj.us and click on the Join button. You can also join in person at a Scottish Rite reunion near you. Your journey to the 32nd degree in Freemasonry awaits. Take the first step at srnmj.us and click on the Join button today. So you have done a great part of, I think, the starting point in your presentation from the Gavel to the Gigabyte is starting around that formation of the Grand Lodge era, the operative to speculative masonry, and now we have the United Grand Lodge of England. You also cover a lot of the additional degrees and the organization of the jurisdictions that were also rolled out during the Grand Lodge era. What are some of the other contributions? And this is the part of your program that I really was drawn to when you talk about contributions that the Grand Lodge did for Freemasonry. And it could be something as simple as a dues card that we still use today.
Yeah, did the Deuce card thing was a huge contribution. That was like 1843. There was actually at post the Morgan affair, there was a period, a really desolate period for Masonry in the United States, and Freemasonry kind of was rebirthed from the embers. Grand lodges from all across America got together and kind of reorganized themselves into what we know as today to be Freemasonry. And they introduced annual due structure for members because they had up to this point a big issue because of Masonic exposés. Brothers were finding admittance into the craft without actually being a member initiated into the craft. And what this allowed for in the United States was a huge influx of capital that allowed many Grand Lodges to start actually building their own temples and halls. But a really amazing contribution to the Grand Lodge of England was actually Prince Hall, 1784, I believe, like post Revolution America. After we cut ties with Britain, Prince Hall was established as a military lodge via the Grand Lodge of Ireland in I think 1774, around there. And they in post the Revolution, they wanted admittance through I think the Boston Grand Lodge, and they were rejected. And so to gain an official charter, they ended up going through Grand Lodge of England, who actually gave them that charter to form African Lodge Number One. If it wasn't for that, I fear that Freemasonry would not be what it is today by any means. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, the Grand Lodge really set up the, as I call it, the franchise model that we still benefit from today. And one of the great things looking at it like a franchise was standardization of ritual. And that was a huge thing because up until that point, we weren't writing a lot of things down because you really couldn't and you weren't supposed to. And because you now had a bunch of lodges getting together and saying, hey, we're all going to act as one lodge underneath this Grand Lodge, as far as organizationally speaking, we all have to have the same ritual. We all have to be, quote unquote, speaking the same Masonic language with each other. And that's what makes it so interesting when you travel around to different jurisdictions and you go, oh, I can see the influence of one Grand Lodge to another Grand Lodge, and then all the little seedlings that popped up after that.
Which is really funny because that really backfired on the Grand Lodge, Premier Grand Lodge, so much so that the those who were still aligned with the operative old charges and everything deemed themselves, I think by 1751, as a separate Grand Lodge entirely from the Premier Grand Lodge. So they called themselves the Ancients versus versus the moderns, and they had different rituals. And during that time too, the French were not really into the presentation of the third degree, so they go off and make like the Lodge of Perfection and Lodge of Perfect Harmony, and that rolls into Scottish Rite Masonry. And there's some interesting stuff going on in Ireland, and that ends up by early 1800s infusing itself, or actually late 1700s, infusing itself as Royal Arch Masonry. Yeah, it's really, really interesting that by trying to pull everybody together and standardizing things, they actually had this period of utter chaos. And it wasn't until 1813 when the ancients and the moderns got back together and kind of settled their differences that we really standardized ritual. But it wasn't necessarily Grand Lodge who we need to take our hats off to. It's really William Preston who and Dr. George Oliver, like some of our forefathers of the craft, who started to standardize lectures and started to compile works that both the ancients and moderns would look at with respect. And those are actually the works that then Grand Lodge said, okay, this is the stuff. Like, if we're gonna do this, this is how we're gonna do it.
And what you're talking about for any new Mason, because I remember myself going, okay, how did we go from, if the degrees were, I love the analogy earlier, like a football game, where you have the first half and it's like this way with a very ritual, like when you think of the term ritual, that is exactly what the first part is like. And you're like, then we go to like halftime break, and then the second half of the game is more of a college style lecture and very philosophical and completely different than what I just experienced in the first part of this. How come there's this difference? Well, where did this all come from? Where did these were, and as you're talking about, like these were the wars that were literally happening with the, as I like to refer to it, as the practice of Freemasonry, how we're going to do this. And it started out with, I'm sure, I'm not going to stand up and put my hand in this way. I practice masonry this way, and this is how we're going to do it here. And we're not going to say these words. We're going to say these words this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we got to hand it back again to technology too, to because if it wasn't for these printed monitors for these guys to all be like, okay, I know we've been doing it this way, but this is actually a really cool way to do it.
Yeah.
I don't think we ever would have really settled into where we're at. The dust would have always just been kicked up in the air. It would have been this crazy rodeo of signals and signs and tokens and words and ritual. Before we would have known it, it would have been, God. I think the number I came across in the history of one of the ancient Scottish Rite books is there was at one point 1,100 separate different, like separate rituals that were being practiced by the latter part of the 1700s.
And you had one brother that was out there chasing all of those aprons.
Yeah.
He wanted to be the Royal Order of the 11,000th
Oh my God.
degree Freemason.
Well, back then you also, before the dues card structure, you paid just to receive a degree. So some of these guys who were out there, like they were definitely looking for every degree that they could get, but they must have been spending thousands of dollars, you know? And on the flip side, part of what was happening too, where you had people taking advantage of that system and conferring completely bogus degrees in order to get some change. They used to call these the mutton degrees, where guys would put on a ritual for basically a meal.
And now it's kind of the other way around. We put on a meal to get people to show up for.
Yeah.
It kind of worked out that way. I can tell, this presentation, because it covered the span of 300 years, the history of Freemasonry as we now know it, there had to be some points where you're like, man, it would be so cool if we hopped in Doc Brown's time machine and traveled back to this time. I would have loved to have sat in a lodge, or I would have loved to heard this particular lecture, or even met this Mason. Is there any point that comes to your mind where you're like, yeah, this would have been cool. This would have been a really cool time in the history of Freemasonry to be a brother?
I mean, without sounding too hokey, I'm really happy to be a Freemason today.
Okay.
But because I have this appreciation for, if history repeats itself, then right now we're at the threshold of a Masonic revival. Like when we look back to the 1700s, which I would have loved to be around back then, or in the 1600s, in like around 1666, after the Great Fire of London decimated 80% of London. King Charles II passed a decree that all new structures must be of brick or stone. And all of a sudden, masonry was like in vogue. It was a hotbed of operative masonry there. And I think that had a lot to do in the revival of the craft and the infusion of alchemy and royal art into what the science of that was, and all of that. It would have been cool, but I also wasn't a big fan of the Black Plague, which had its last leg in 1665.
That'd have been the get out, bug out time.
But at all of these periods, like right now, like after the pandemic, we hit this real low point, but we're kind of starting this upward trajectory, or I'd like to believe that we're starting an upward trajectory. In 1717 and through like 1723, you as a brother could directly contribute to the trajectory of the craft. And I think what's cool about the Scottish Rite is Albert Pike had said in the latter part of the 1800s that if he came back in 100 years, he wouldn't want to be able to recognize the Scottish Rite, any of those degrees. He believed that it should always be this organic, evolving thing. And I do think that there is a level of Freemasonry that needs to be this evolving story. And right now we at this crossroads of esotericism and spirituality and technology. Like we have this really interesting opportunity to expand into the digital age and contribute to the craft in ways that brothers have never been able to do so before. Like you yourself, Michael, you're doing this podcast and reaching thousands of brothers every week, and that is amazing.
It is pretty amazing, because otherwise I would just be talking to you on the phone from.
In the parking lot.
This has been the Craftsman Online podcast. I want to thank my guests this week for coming on, Brother Jason Short. If you love him here, you're going to love him as a contributing writer for our blog at craftsmanonline.com. And of course, he's one of our returning guests on the Craftsman Online Reading Room panel. I don't know if there's anything left we could create for you.
I'm just happy to be here.
We are very happy to have you along. If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear some more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. Yes, we're available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.